They prayed for a child till their knees cracked and their hope went brittle. But the Lord answered not with a birth, only silence. Until one night, two small shadows curled in the hay made them believe again. The sound came soft, barely more than a shuffle in the hay. Ruth Porter stirred first. She always did. 37 years of rising before the sun had taught her how to hear trouble before it knocked. It wasn't wind, wasn't mice. She knew the rhythm of animals and night noises by heart, and this wasn't that. She rose from the bed slow, her joints aching like old branches, and reached for the lamp. Amos shifted beside her, his breath steady in the dark. "Something in the barn," she said, voice low. He didn't ask how she knew. Amos Porter had long since stopped doubting the things Ruth felt. Instead, he sat up with a quiet grunt, pulled on his boots, and followed her through the creaking boards of their quiet house. The sky outside was deep navy, just before morning but not yet light. The barn sat like a lump against the edge of their property, framed by the last breath of moonlight and the whisper of trees beyond. They moved without talk. "No need." Ruth held the lamp high as they crossed the yard, her shawl tugged close, wind teasing gray wisps of hair from her braid. Amos opened the barn door with practiced slowness, one hand tight on the old iron latch. The hinges creaked like they always did, and the smell of hay, earth, and old leather drifted out. Inside, their mule blinked sleepily. The chickens rustled. But there, tucked in the far stall where the lantern barely reached, was movement. Two small figures, huddled close beneath an old feed sack, the shape of their backs trembling with breath. Ruth stepped forward, ignoring Amos's hand reaching for her sleeve. The figures didn't move. One coughed. A girl's cough, thin, hoarse, the kind that hadn't known water in too long. Then a whisper, "Don't tell, please." Ruth froze. And something in her heart, something buried under years of unspoken prayers and empty arms, cracked open. She set the lamp down gently. "It's all right," she said, kneeling slowly, every bone in her knees grinding in protest. "Ain't nobody here to harm you." The older girl shifted. Her face emerged from the shadows, dirty, thin, eyes wide and dry from crying too long to make tears anymore. Behind her, another child clung to the back of her dress, smaller, just a slip of a girl, maybe 7, maybe less. Big eyes, silent mouth. "We don't got nowhere," the older one whispered. Ruth didn't answer with words. She reached into the hay beside her, pulled the old quilt folded for the mule's bedding, and draped it over both girls without pause. She didn't ask their names, not yet. Didn't ask why they were here. That could come later. The only thing she said was, "You'll sleep in the house tonight." Amos didn't speak until they'd helped the girls up the path and into the kitchen. He watched them settle on the floor near the stove, watched Ruth pour warm milk and find bread, her hands moving like she'd done this every day of her life. He pulled her aside. "You think this is wise," he murmured. "I think this is providence," Ruth answered, "and I don't believe in turning providence away." Their names came later. The older one was May, the younger Nora. Sisters, no parents, no home, no plan except to keep walking west and stay together. May was 9, brave beyond her years. Her chin didn't tremble even when her hands did. She kept herself between Nora and the world at all times, even as her own feet cracked and bled. Nora hardly spoke. She barely blinked. She'd gone quiet in a way that broke Ruth's heart just to witness, but she clung to May's hand like it was the only thread tying her to the world, and maybe it was. They said little that first day. May napped curled against Nora's back while Ruth cleaned dirt from their hair and washed their socks by hand. Amos stayed outside most of the morning, splitting wood, fixing the fence that hadn't truly needed fixing. By the time he came in for lunch, the girls had eaten every biscuit in the tin and both were asleep again near the hearth. "They run from something," he said. Ruth nodded. "Something bad." He set his jaw. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I'm thinking they don't need questions right now," Ruth said. "They need peace." Amos grunted. Peace don't come easy in a world like this. Maybe not, she said, but this house has room for it. That night, Ruth took the girls upstairs. She laid them on the old guest bed that hadn't been slept in for decades, not since her sister's boy came through sick with yellow fever and never made it back out. She tucked the covers around them like they were her own, like she'd done it 1,000 times. And still they didn't ask to stay. Still they didn't cry or beg. May only whispered, "We'll go in the morning, promise. We didn't mean to take nothing." But Ruth just pressed a hand to her cheek and said, "You're not taking, you're staying." The next morning, when the girls woke to the smell of fried eggs and fresh cornbread, the house already felt different, brighter, warmer, lived in. And as May sat beside Amos at the table, stealing glances at his calloused hands and weathered eyes, something flickered in her expression. Hesitation, maybe, or hope. And when Ruth passed Nora a wooden doll from the shelf, she dusted every Sunday for 30 years but never dared touch, the little girl held it like a miracle. Neither of them spoke their thanks. But they didn't need to. Ruth and Amos felt it in their bones. God hadn't given them children of their own. But he hadn't forgotten them either. He just waited till the time was right. May didn't sleep much that second night. Ruth could tell by the way the quilt shifted now and then in the soft hush of upstairs darkness, like the girl kept turning over thoughts she didn't want to keep. From the bed across the room, Nora slept soundly, limbs slack, face turned toward the wall, breathing steady. Ruth had checked on them twice already, barefoot and quiet, the floorboards beneath her feet groaning like old men do when rising. The first time May had been curled tightly around her sister. The second time, she was lying flat on her back, eyes open, staring at the ceiling with a look far too grown for a girl that age. By dawn, May was dressed before either Ruth or Amos had stirred, standing near the kitchen table with her boots in her hand, and a frayed satchel over one shoulder. Ruth found her like that, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds, body taut as a bowstring. "You leavin'?" Ruth asked gently, voice still sleep-warm. May stiffened. "We stayed longer than we meant to. Thank you for the food and the bed." "You didn't take anything that wasn't offered," Ruth said. "You're not trouble, May." May's jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked like she might bolt straight into the yard. Then her gaze flicked toward the stairwell. "Nora's safe here," she whispered, as if confessing a sin. "I wanted her to have one more night before we—" "You don't have to run anymore," Ruth interrupted, firm but kind. "You hear me?" May didn't answer. She set her boots down and walked to the window, staring out at the rising sun spilling light over Amos's pasture. The sky was gold and pale blue, and dew clung to every blade of grass like it hadn't made up its mind to stay or vanish. "Men came after us last week," she said softly. "Not law, worse, took our ma. They laughed when she screamed." Ruth stood still. "Before that," May continued, "we were walkin' with a wagon train. Pa was gone already. Fever took him. Some folks said they'd look after us, said we was too small to keep up alone. But when it got dark—" Her voice broke for the first time. "They changed their minds." Ruth didn't push. She crossed the room slowly, reached for the kettle, and began heating water like it was any other day. She listened to the silence stretch out until it didn't feel like silence anymore, just space for pain to exist. "I prayed that night," May whispered. "Didn't think I still knew how, but I asked God to hide us, asked him to get us to a place with a roof. Didn't even ask for food, just somewhere that didn't smell like sweat and smoke and blood." Ruth set 2 mugs on the table. "I think he heard me," May said, voice almost inaudible now. "But I don't know if we get to stay." "You think he brought you here just to make you leave again?" Ruth asked quietly. May's eyes brimmed, but the tears didn't fall. "Sometimes," she said, "I think maybe he gets tired of saving the same people over and over." Ruth reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't wear out grace, child. Not ever. Not if you live to be 90 and cry every night. Not if you shout and blame him sometimes. He made room for that too. Amos came in just as the water boiled. He looked between the two of them and didn't say a word. Instead, he kissed Ruth's temple, poured 3 mugs, and handed one to May like it was the most natural thing in the world. May blinked at it, then looked up at him. "You're not mad?" she asked. Amos shrugged. Can't be mad at someone for trying to protect their sister. May's lip trembled. After breakfast, Amos took May with him to mend a section of fence on the far edge of the pasture. Ruth could see them from the window, Amos showing her how to brace the rails, May watching every movement like it was a sermon. Nora stayed close by Ruth, first helping with chores, then drawing pictures in the dust with a stick. She didn't talk much, but she smiled when Ruth praised her efforts, and that smile was its own kind of voice. They spent the week that way, quiet mornings, long afternoons, stories by lamplight, fresh bread cooling on the windowsill. The girls changed, slowly. Their shoulders softened. They laughed more. May even climbed the peach tree behind the house once, just to see the whole valley laid out below her. Nora started to hum, especially when Ruth brushed her hair or sat near the stove knitting. Then came the knock. It was dusk, the sky bleeding orange and purple over the hills. Ruth was folding laundry. Amos was in the barn. May and Nora were playing marbles on the porch, their heads bent close. The knock came sharp. 2 raps hard. Ruth opened the door slow. 3 men stood there. Not lawmen. Not neighbors. Their clothes were clean in a way that didn't fit the dirt road, and their boots shone too bright for men who worked. One had a scar along his chin. Another wore a bowler hat tilted back like he wanted folks to know he wasn't hiding nothing. The third spoke. "We're looking for 2 girls, sisters." Ruth's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Ain't no girls here you need to be looking for." The man smiled. "I'm sure you believe that." Ruth didn't flinch. "You can turn your horses around and ride back the way you came." Bowler Hat stepped forward. "Lady, those girls belong to a man who paid good money for their passage west. They ran off. That's theft." Ruth's voice dropped like an axe. "You'll call it what you want. I call it survival." May stepped into the doorway behind her then. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stood with her arms around Nora, who stared up at the men like a cornered fawn. Amos came around the corner of the barn a moment later, shotgun cradled casually in his arms. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. His presence alone stopped the men cold. "I suggest you ride," he said. The men looked between him and Ruth. They knew better than to push. They turned, muttering curses under their breath, boots crunching on the gravel as they mounted up. Scarred Chin looked back once, eyes full of threat. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Amos didn't blink. "We won't," Ruth said. They rode off into the dark. And just like that, the quiet returned. But it wasn't the same. That night, May didn't sleep upstairs. She sat by the door, watching it, daring it to move. Ruth brought her a quilt and set a cup of warm milk beside her. "They'll come back," May said. "They won't get you," Ruth answered. "How do you know?" "Because this is our house," Ruth said simply. "And in this house, no one gets left behind." May cried then. The kind of tears she hadn't let herself cry in weeks, maybe years. And Ruth held her. Held her like she was born from her own body. Like nothing in the world mattered more. The days that followed moved like smoke, slow, curling, sometimes warm, sometimes choking. Ruth could feel the weight of that visit in every board of the house, in the way Amos checked the locks twice now before bed, in how May started sleeping with her boots still on and Nora refused to be out of Ruth's sight. But they didn't talk about it. Not much. The words were too heavy, too jagged. So instead they worked. Amos mended the south pasture fence with a quiet urgency. Ruth baked more bread than usual, even though there were only 4 of them. May helped with the animals, waking earlier each morning. And Nora, sweet little Nora, began speaking again, just bits and pieces, often whispered in Ruth's apron as she clung to her waist during chores. The quiet wasn't peace, not yet, but it was trying. One morning, just as dew still clung to the grass and a soft wind stirred through the cottonwoods, Amos found a small trinket near the barn. A button, silver, engraved with a flower, not the kind a rancher wore, not something May or Nora had lost either. He held it for a moment, his brow darkening before tucking it deep into his pocket. He didn't show Ruth, not yet, but all that day he kept his rifle closer, never said why. He didn't need to. That evening, Ruth sat with May on the porch steps, snapping beans into a wooden bowl. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the hills, and a cicada buzzed lazy from the tree near the well. "Do you think he'll come himself next time?" May asked suddenly. Ruth stopped mid-snap. "Who?" "The man who paid for us." Her voice was calm, too calm, like she'd rehearsed the thought too many times to let fear show. "I hope he's afraid to," Ruth said after a moment. "And if he isn't, then he's a fool." May didn't look convinced. "What if he brings more men?" she asked. "He might," Ruth said honestly. "But you're not alone now, May. That changes things." The girl nodded slowly. "Nora's had dreams, bad ones. She says he'll come with fire." Ruth set the beans aside. "We'll meet him with water." The next day it rained. Not hard. A steady drizzle that softened the edges of everything, the barn, the hills, the fear. Ruth took it as a sign. She let the girls stay in their dresses, barefoot in the mud, spinning beneath the gray sky until they collapsed in laughter. Amos watched from the porch, his weathered face softening. He remembered something then. He hadn't heard laughter like that since the day Ruth had told him the doctor's words. 30 years. No children. No reason why. It had broken him. But this was something different. Not a miracle, not yet, but maybe the beginning of one. That night Ruth found a letter on the fence post by the road. No stamp, no return, just folded parchment wet from rain with her name scratched in ink that bled. Inside, "Return what isn't yours or lose what is." She read it twice, then burned it in the stove, flames curling over the words until they were ash. She didn't tell Amos. She didn't need to. He knew the look in her eye when she came in. By morning, Amos had fortified the barn, reinforced the back door, buried 2 old rifles beneath the floorboards near the hearth. Ruth made sure the girls knew where to hide if the shouting came back. But the shouting didn't come. Not yet. Instead, 2 days later, a boy rode up alone, maybe 13, thin, pale, dressed too fine for someone that age to be traveling in the rain. He stopped by the gate, lifted a hand and waited. Amos approached first, rifle slung but ready. The boy didn't flinch. "Name S. Caleb," he said. "My master sent me." Amos didn't answer. "He says the girls were purchased legally. He says they're property." Amos stepped closer. "They're children." The boy blinked rain from his lashes. "He says he'll offer gold, enough to replace M, more than they're worth." Amos's knuckles whitened. Then the boy pulled something from his satchel. A doll, fabric handmade, eyes stitched in black thread. "Nora's." "She dropped it," the boy said, "back then when she was taken." Ruth had come to the porch now, May just behind her, face white. "Tell your master," Amos said slowly, voice cold as mountain water, "that the next messenger won't be sent back." Caleb swallowed. "I'm not coming back. I was never supposed to." "What do you mean?" Ruth asked. The boy hesitated, looked around, then dropped his voice. "He wanted me to watch, map the place, count heads, but I ain't doing it." "Why?" Ruth asked, stepping off the porch. The boy's hands trembled. "Because I got a sister, ma'am, and I seen what he does to girls he thinks no one'll miss." He left the doll on the gate post, then turned his horse and vanished into the trees. Amos stood there for a long time. They didn't sleep that night, none of them. At midnight Ruth heard a noise, a single snap far off, but loud enough. She roused Amos. He was already sitting upright. May was awake too. Nora lay still, but her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling like she'd known this would come. "Go," Amos said to Ruth. "Take the girls back hatch, stay low." She nodded, heart pounding. They slipped out into the wet black, the girls clinging to Ruth's hands. Beneath the orchard trees, they huddled behind the tool shed. Ruth kept her body over theirs like a shield. Gunfire cracked once. Then silence. Then again closer. Back at the house, Amos moved like a ghost. He lit no lamps, opened no doors, just shifted through shadow, waiting. And then they came. 5 of them. Lanterns low, faces wrapped in cloth. One threw a bottle. It landed against the barn wall, shattering, flames climbing up with it. But before it caught, Amos stepped out. He didn't shout. Didn't warn. He just raised the shotgun and fired. One dropped screaming. The others ran. But Amos didn't chase. He waited, breath heavy, hands steady. Behind him, the barn smoldered. He turned and saw the flame licking toward the hay. He ran. Threw open the doors, doused the edges with the water barrel, smothered sparks with his own coat, coughing, soaked, burned at the wrists, but he saved it. When Ruth returned with the girls, dawn was breaking. Amos was on his knees in the mud, exhausted. Nora ran to him first, flinging her arms around his neck. May wasn't far behind. Ruth said nothing. She knelt beside him, held his hand. They didn't need words. That morning, Ruth wrote a letter of her own. Not to the law, not to the town. To the judge. An old friend of Amos's. A man who owed them both. The kind who still feared God. And justice. Because this wasn't over. But it would be soon. The letter Ruth sent reached Judge Horace Durnley by courier 2 days later, tucked into the folds of a flour sack beneath 2 loaves of dense sourdough bread and a jar of apple preserves. The judge lived 3 towns east, in a house too fine for the weather to touch and too proud to be humble. He was an old friend of Amos once, or close enough, one of the few men who still remembered the debt Amos had paid in blood when he stood between law and land war in the cattle years. Horace had always said if Amos ever needed something, he just had to write. So Ruth did. She wrote what happened in the barn, what they'd found, what came in the night. She didn't ask for permission. She asked for right. The kind that God wouldn't let Amos keep silent about. Judge Durnley didn't write back. He came. 4 days after the fire, a dust-covered coach pulled into the road outside the Chandler place. Ruth was feeding the hens with Nora tucked against her hip when she saw the man step down. No deputies, no fanfare. Just him, with his stiff coat and ivory-handled cane, moving like a man unaccustomed to uneven ground. Amos met him halfway between the gate and the porch. They didn't shake hands. They didn't have to. "I read your wife's letter," Horace said. "Had to twice. Couldn't believe it the first time." Amos didn't answer. Horace's mouth thinned. This man who thinks girls can be bought, he got a name. Amos nodded once. Jedediah Crane. Horace exhaled slowly. Figures. Been whispers about him since last winter. Bought up 3 of the tenant farms after their owners disappeared. Bought them for pennies, some say, from widows too afraid to speak. "He's worse than whispers," Amos said. "He's real, and he wants them back." Horace looked past Amos then toward the house where Ruth had stepped out onto the porch. Nora peeked from behind her skirt. May stood in the doorway, arms folded tight. Horace tipped his hat. "You have witnesses." "Don't need 'em," Amos replied. "Have truth." "Well, truth ain't what it used to be," Horace muttered. "But I've still got ink and a seal, and I reckon I've still got a bit of weight in court." He turned. "I'll issue papers, nullify any claim he thinks he's got, if he pushes it further." "He will," Amos said. Horace looked him square. "Then we push back harder." They stayed the night, Judge Durnley and his coachman sleeping in the guest room Ruth hadn't opened since the year before. Horace asked questions around the table, gentle ones, not the kind that probed. May answered some. Ruth answered the rest. Nora only whispered once, when she showed the judge a scar on her ankle, thin and red, shaped like a chain. He didn't say a word, but his hand trembled when he touched his tea. The next morning he left, but not before pressing a folded paper into Amos's hand. "This'll hold," he said, "for now." "For now," Amos repeated. They watched the coach vanish into the trees. The following week passed without incident. Spring reached out in earnest, and the hills turned green like they remembered how to breathe. The apple trees budded. The hens started laying heavier. Even May began humming when she worked. Ruth didn't trust it. Nor did Amos. Every day felt like a taut rope, beautiful, but one fray away from snapping. And then came the morning of the church social. Ruth hadn't planned on going, not after the fire, not with eyes in the woods, but Amos said something that stopped her. "If we don't live like we belong," he said, "then they've already taken more than they paid for." So she dressed the girls in Sunday white, their shoes polished for the first time in months, and she braided May's hair while humming an old hymn neither of them knew the words to anymore. Amos wore his wedding coat, the one he hadn't fit into since the frost took their last calf and their hope of family with it. The church was just a half-mile's ride, and the road was thick with wagons and laughter. Children ran between horses, and pies passed from hand to hand. No one asked about the new girls, not directly, but everyone saw. Some nodded, some whispered, some stared, but none turned away. Pastor Kellen gave a sermon about grace and storms, and how sometimes salvation doesn't come as light, but as hands in the dark. Ruth looked at May and Nora, then at Amos. She felt it settle in her chest like something holy. After the service, as the sun spilled gold over the steeple, a man approached. Ruth saw him first, tall, lean, wearing a coat too fine for the dust, with boots polished down to a shine that didn't belong to this land. His eyes were cold, not angry, not loud, just cold, like something hollow wore a face. "Ma'am," he said to Ruth. She stepped in front of the girls without thinking. The man smiled. "I believe you've got something of mine." Amos was beside her in an instant. "I believe you're mistaken," he said evenly. The man turned. "Jedediah Crane." "I know who you are." Crane looked past him. "May, Nora, I remember those names." "You've got no claim," Amos said, lifting the folded paper Judge Durnley had given him. "Not by law, not by God." Crane took the paper, skimmed it. Then, still smiling, he tore it clean down the middle. Gasps echoed around the churchyard. Pastor Kellen stepped forward. Crane held up a hand. "Easy now. I'm just reminding folks that ink don't stop a man who's got land and money." "You touch them," Amos said, stepping closer, "and you'll find out what else ink don't stop." Crane's smile faded just slightly. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked away. But Ruth knew. He wasn't finished. They returned home in silence. The girls didn't ask questions. They knew better. That night Ruth sat by the window, watching the trees move, waiting for flames that didn't come. And when dawn broke, it brought a letter, pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife. The blade buried clean through the wood. The parchment fluttered beneath it. Ruth pulled it free, unfolded it, and read only 5 words. "The night belongs to me." She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just went back inside and lit the stove. The fire would not go out again. The letter remained on the kitchen table for the better part of the morning. No one spoke about it, though all had read it. May had taken it from Ruth's hands when the old woman turned away, studying the sharp penmanship as if the meaning lay deeper than the words. Nora stood behind her, silent, her small fingers curling into the edge of Ruth's shawl like the child she hadn't allowed herself to be in weeks. Amos had said nothing after setting it down. Just lit the fire higher, louder, as though he meant to drown it all out in the roar of flame. And Ruth, for her part, moved quietly through the house with the kettle and the bread pan, not out of fear but something worse, expectation. Like she'd known this would come. Like she'd known peace was never made for folks who try to rewrite endings already written. By noon, Amos saddled the mule and rode out to town without saying why. He didn't need to. There were errands men ran when they had to fix a fence or fetch a doctor, and then there were errands for when war circled the gate. Ruth kissed his cheek on the porch and pressed 2 biscuits into his palm like communion. He didn't look back when he left. He returned by sundown, boots heavy with dust and a sack slung over his shoulder. Ruth saw the glint of iron between folds, barrel oiled and silent. He locked it behind the pantry door without a word. There was no speech to be made, no battle cry to holler, just a quiet, final understanding between 2 people who had long ago decided that God didn't always answer prayers with peace. Sometimes he answered with resolve. 3 nights passed with no sound but the whippoorwills. The 4th brought rain. It started as a drizzle, then thickened to a curtain that swept across the field and turned the dry creek into a swollen, snarling tongue. Ruth watched it from the porch wrapped in Amos's old coat. She kept the lantern lit beside her, not to see but to be seen. If Crane meant to creep close, she wanted him to know. The light was still burning. The house was still watched. They were not hiding. Inside, the girls slept in the main room now. Ruth had pushed the beds together and laid quilts thick enough to smother any nightmare. May curled instinctively toward Nora in the night, and Nora often stirred with sharp, startled gasps that faded into sleep when she realized where she was. Amos kept the Winchester by the door and sat in his rocker well past midnight, listening for hoofbeats that never came. But the absence of sound was worse. It meant planning. It meant patience. And that, more than anything, was what Crane had in abundance. On the 5th night, the hens screamed. Amos was out the door before the echo died. Ruth came second, holding a lantern high, the beam cutting jagged lines through the wet dark. At the coop, feathers floated like ghosts. The door was ajar. The latch wasn't broken, it had been lifted, deliberate and gentle. No blood, no fox, no teeth marks. Just gone. 3 hens, the plumpest. The ones Ruth named. She buried them in the garden the next morning. Not because she believed in graves for chickens, but because something about the act steadied her hands. When you put something in the ground and say words over it, it can't be taken again. That was the rule of the land. And Crane, for all his cruelty, still had to bow to the land eventually. But that night the porch steps creaked. It was subtle, a weight shift, a breath. Amos was already awake when he heard it. He rose slowly, lifting the rifle finger to the trigger. Ruth sat up too. They didn't speak. They just moved like they had rehearsed this moment all their lives. Outside, wind clattered the branches and the rain had stopped, leaving the world too quiet. Amos opened the door with his shoulder, lantern first, rifle second. Nothing moved. The steps were dry, no prints. Until Ruth saw it by the gate. A doll. May's. Hung by its yarn hair from the top post. Its face painted with soot. And stitched into its chest in black thread, a single word. Mine. Ruth unhooked it with trembling hands. May hadn't woken. Nora stirred but didn't cry out. The quiet of the house was a weight. And outside, Amos stared at the tree line with a rage so deep it looked like stillness. I'll build traps, he said. No, Ruth answered. You'll build something better. She pointed toward the barn. 2 hours later, the traps were still built. But so was a second lock on the girls' room, a new brace on the front door, and oil soaked into every creaking hinge. Amos laid a board along the floor inside the hallway that would groan if stepped on. Ruth hung bells from the rafters near the windows, and in the barn, beneath the old stall that used to hold their mule, Amos dug. By dawn, he'd set something down there. Not a weapon. A warning. Inside the shallow hole, he buried Crane's name, scrawled on a splinter of wood. Over it he laid a stone, red from the creek, etched with the verse Ruth had sewn into every quilt since the war. No weapon formed against thee shall prosper. It wasn't superstition, it wasn't spellwork. It was defiance. And for 2 more nights, the woods held still. Until May screamed. It was a scream that split the dark clean in two, high, sharp, filled with the kind of horror no dream could summon. Amos reached her first, lantern swinging, rifle in hand. Ruth followed. The girls were standing by the window, pressed together like paper dolls, pointing outside. A fire. Not the house. The fields. A long line of flame, coiled like a serpent along the western edge of the property. It hadn't started with lightning, there'd been no storm. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. The land burns too. Amos rushed outside with a blanket soaked in water, beating at the edge of the blaze. Ruth followed with another, calling to the sky, to God, to whatever angel still hovered over the house. And together, they fought it back inch by inch, until their hands bled and the smoke choked the edge of dawn. When it was done, Amos stood blackened by ash, shoulders sagging. Ruth turned to the house. And froze. The front door was open. Just a crack. Enough. She ran, lantern raised, calling the names like litany. May. Nora. But they were there, asleep. Still there. Yet something was different. At the foot of their bed was a box. Old wooden, unlocked. Amos opened it. Inside were 4 silver hairpins, a woman's torn scarf, and a letter. Scrawled in a different hand. I take what's mine. Tonight the debt is paid. Ruth pressed her hand over her heart. Amos shut the box. No more warnings. No more time. If Crane wanted a war, he'd stepped into the wrong house. The fire left a black scar through the western acres. The wheat fields blistered and curled like old paper touched by flame. The smell of smoke clung to every wall, every stitch of cloth, even the girls' hair, though Ruth scrubbed them both with water drawn cold from the well. May refused to speak. Her fingers clutched Ruth's apron as if afraid the very earth might open and swallow her. Nora only sat by the hearth, eyes fixed on the box they'd found, her small frame barely moving, except to shiver now and again like her soul had caught a chill it couldn't shake. Amos didn't say much the next morning. He boarded the door tighter, checked the rifle twice, then stood outside in the yard where the light barely touched and stared toward the woods. The trees looked unchanged, harmless even, but he knew better. Crane had watched them from there. Maybe even stepped close, crossed the fence line, placed that box down with the same hands that once wrapped around Ruth's wrist like manacles. That scarf in the box, it was hers. She hadn't worn it in years, hadn't seen it since before the man disappeared after the trial. She thought it lost. But there it was, folded like a lover's goodbye, resting atop the pins that used to belong to her sister. He took from me then, Ruth whispered, standing behind Amos. Now he wants to take again. Amos turned to her. His face was hard now, not with fear but resolve. He'll try, he said, but he won't. And with that, they began preparing for a siege. It wasn't a matter of guns and bullets, though Amos did clean the rifle until it gleamed. It was about hearts and walls, about being ready when the dark moved. Ruth baked until the house filled with the scent of bread and roasted root. She wanted warmth in every corner, light in every room. Amos cut firewood until his hands cracked. He nailed iron bits to the thresholds, planted jars filled with sharpened nails beneath the windows. And inside, Ruth taught the girls what to do if they heard a noise, where to run, where to hide. They didn't call it a game, but she tried to keep it from feeling like terror. By the 3rd day, May finally spoke. Will he hurt us? Ruth kneeled in front of her, brushing hair from the child's forehead. No, she said, Because your papa won't let him. She didn't mean Crane. She meant Amos. And May seemed to understand. That night Amos sat at the table sharpening a blade. It wasn't meant for fighting. It was the same knife he'd used to carve the girls' toys, to shape firewood, to split kindling. But tonight it looked different, like it had teeth. "I've been thinking," he said finally. Ruth looked up from her sewing. About how long he's been watching. He knew where to find the scarf, knew what to write in that letter, knew the names. "Too much," Ruth murmured. "He knows too much." Amos nodded, which means he's close. That thought hung heavy over the house. They slept in shifts now. Amos stayed up from dusk till the middle of the night, Ruth from then till dawn. The girls slept between them, barricaded behind locked doors and drawn curtains. On the 7th night since the box, the sound came. Not fire this time. Not footsteps. Music. A single whistle drifting through the trees. A lullaby twisted into a slow dirge, the notes familiar yet wrong, like something meant to soothe had been bent until it hurt. Ruth heard it first. She stood by the window, not daring to look out. Amos heard it next, rising from his chair and moving to the front door with slow, even steps. The whistle stopped. A voice called out. "You took what's mine, Ruth." It wasn't shouted, wasn't angry. It was low, even measured. Like a man stating fact. Ruth gripped the back of the chair so tightly her knuckles whitened. Amos didn't open the door. He didn't speak. He just waited. "I gave you years," the voice continued. "Gave you silence. I watched. I waited. But you've grown fat with other people's prayers, those girls." A pause. "They should have been mine. That did it." Ruth threw open the door, fury boiling so hot it melted fear clean off. "You don't get to say that," she snapped, voice sharp as ice. "You don't get to speak their names. You gave up your right to every good thing the day you laid your hands on me." The figure stepped into the light. He was older than she remembered, less like the monster from her nightmares and more like a man whose sins had eaten him alive from the inside out. His eyes were sunken, his mouth pulled into a near-permanent sneer. But it was him, Crane, in the flesh. And he smiled. "I never gave up," he said. "You just ran faster than I expected." Amos stepped in front of her. "She didn't run," he said. "She survived." Crane chuckled. "And now you think you can protect her." "I don't think," Amos said, raising the rifle slowly, calmly. "I know." Crane's smile faltered, just a little. Behind him, more figures moved. 3. No, 4. Men rough-faced with hands that had done bad work, but they didn't speak. They just stood, waiting for the order. Amos didn't blink. "You want to try, go ahead," he said, "but you won't leave standing." Crane looked at him for a long moment, then at Ruth. Then he turned away. No words, no threats. Just silence. But Amos didn't lower the rifle until the woods had swallowed them whole. That night, Ruth sat with the girls while Amos boarded every window tighter. "They won't go far," she whispered. "No," Amos said, "but they crossed a line tonight, and next time, they won't knock." It was the final night of waiting. The war would come before dawn. The wind was quiet for once, but the silence it left behind was louder than thunder. The boards creaked overhead with the shifting weight of winter's breath, and inside the farmhouse every lamp had been snuffed but one. Ruth sat by it, wrapped in Amos's thick old coat, the same he'd worn every day for years in the field but never once brought into bed. Now it clung to her shoulders like armor. Her hands rested in her lap, still and firm, but her eyes never left the window. Amos was out there. He'd gone just before midnight, rifle strapped to his back, knife at his side. Not to meet the enemy, but to move the fight away from the girls. He didn't tell Ruth exactly where he'd go, only that she'd know when it started. His words were soft but iron-weighted. "If they want blood, let it be mine, but not theirs. never theirs. He kissed her once before going. Not a long kiss, not a goodbye, just enough to let her feel the breath of him before he stepped into the cold. Now she waited. The girls slept in the cellar. She hadn't told them much, just that it was a game and that they needed to stay quiet no matter what they heard. May curled up beneath the quilt with her arms around Nora, and Nora, for all her new silence and strange staring, had whispered once before sleep, "Don't let him take her, Mama. Not you, not us, just her," as if she understood what was coming better than anyone. The first shot cracked at 1:30 in the morning. It rang out sharp as lightning splitting the dark sky, and Ruth flinched as if struck. A second followed not long after, then silence, then 5 more in quick succession. She rose, slow, calm, as if her body remembered another war long ago. She crossed the kitchen, unlatched the back door, and stepped out barefoot onto the frozen earth. The barn burned on the southern edge of the property, fire licking skyward like some wicked tongue, but Ruth knew that was just a distraction. Amos wouldn't be near it. He would have drawn them out into the eastern woods, where the ground dipped low and the trees stood so close a man could vanish between them. She followed. The snow was thin but sharp, crusted over from the last freeze. It crunched beneath her with each step, the sound loud in the hush. She carried the pistol in her apron pocket. It wasn't much. It hadn't been fired in 20 years, but it was loaded and it was hers. She reached the first clearing and found a man slumped against a tree. Not Amos. Crane's man, one of the 4. A knife in the throat, blood gone cold. Ruth didn't linger. She followed the trail, half footprints, half drag marks deeper into the woods. A second body lay twisted in a gully, face down, gun still in hand. A third she nearly missed altogether, tucked beneath a pine bough, jaw slack in death. The fourth one she saw alive. He stumbled from the brush ahead, wheezing, face painted with frost and fear. He didn't see her at first, not until she raised the pistol. "Where is he?" she asked, calm as a prayer. The man froze. He wasn't young. Not old either, just the kind of man who'd never learned how to carry guilt. I don't. She shot. The bullet missed his foot by less than an inch, and he yelped like a beaten dog. "Try again," she said. He lifted a trembling hand. "Back there clearing past the ridge, he's fighting him." "Him?" "The one who talks too quiet with the knife. The tall one, Crane. It's just them now." Ruth didn't ask anything else. She walked past the man, who backed away from her like she was death itself. She didn't even hear him run. Her ears only heard the wind and the sound of something sharp moving through branches ahead. The clearing opened like a mouth, wide and bare under the stars. The trees curved around it like ribs, and in the center 2 men stood locked in a brutal, silent war. Amos had blood on his face. His coat hung torn, one sleeve nearly ripped clean off. Crane stood across from him, breathing heavy but grinning like the devil after a good sermon. "You never should have taken her," he said, voice low and ugly. "You should have let me finish what I started." Amos didn't answer. He lunged. They fell together, fists and elbows and knees, not a battle of skill but desperation. The knife skittered away across the ground. Ruth didn't move. She watched. She waited. Her fingers tightened on the pistol. The 2 men crashed into the snow, rolled, kicked, and then Crane rose with a snarl, fist wrapped around a stone. He brought it down toward Amos's skull. The pistol cracked. Crane staggered. The second shot caught him in the shoulder. Amos rolled free. Crane looked down at his own blood, red and thick on the snow, and then at Ruth. "Still got that spine, I see," he muttered. She raised the gun again. "I had to grow one," she said, "after you broke everything else." He smiled and then charged. The third bullet hit him dead in the chest. This time he didn't rise. Amos crawled to her slowly, breath ragged. She helped him stand. He He leaned against her like a falling beam, both of them shaking, both of them silent for a long, long while. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You found me." She nodded, "Always will." They left Crane where he lay. The trees could have him. Back at the house, the girls were still asleep. Ruth and Amos didn't wake them. They sat instead by the hearth, wrapped in quilts, hands entwined. Amos hadn't cried since his mother died. But that night he let the tears come and Ruth didn't speak. She just held him, rocked him slow, whispered words not meant for anyone else but him. "I never had a family," he said after a long time. She smiled softly. "Now you do." Outside, the fire in the barn burned itself out. Inside, something new had begun. Not peace, but the beginning of it. The morning didn't come easy. It dragged its feet across the hills, pulling pale gray over a sky too tired for color. Amos stirred first, not with a start but with the cautious slowness of a man who knew pain waited behind every motion. His shoulder ached from the fall, his ribs sang with bruises, and his hand bore a deep slice he barely remembered earning. But the worst of it, the threat that had hung over them for days like storm clouds ready to break, was gone. And for the first time in a long time, he let his body relax. Ruth was already awake, though she hadn't moved far. She sat in the rocking chair beside the fire, the same one she used to mend in, eyes fixed on the soft glow of embers. She didn't speak when he opened his eyes, just gave him the faintest nod, like they'd survived something wordless, and that was enough. The girls came up from the cellar just after dawn. May led, her doll tucked under one arm, and Nora clutched her hand tightly. There were no questions, no explanations, just sleepy steps and the kind of silence children learn from watching the grown-ups too closely. May gave Ruth a long look, then padded across the room and crawled into Amos's lap without a word. Nora followed, curling beside him like she'd been there 1,000 times before. "Hungry?" Amos asked, his voice hoarse. May nodded. "Starving," Nora whispered. Ruth smiled and stood. She moved into the kitchen like it was any other morning, pulling down the last of the flour, cracking the final 2 eggs. They didn't have much left, but it didn't matter. Not today. She cooked in silence, pausing only once to glance out the frosted window. The snow was finally melting. It had been 3 days since the night Crane died. No one had come looking for him. The bodies in the woods stayed buried where Amos left them, though he'd returned to pray over each one. Not out of forgiveness. He had none to give, but because the girls asked. May had insisted. "Everyone needs a prayer," she said quietly, not knowing how much weight those words carried. Ruth had gone with him. She didn't speak during the prayers, just held his hand. They didn't talk about what came next until the 4th morning. The wind was quiet again, the cold retreating little by little. Ruth was drying linens by the fire, and Amos was cleaning out the henhouse, shoulders still stiff from healing. The girls played in the field just past the porch, their laughter sharp against the soft air. Amos leaned against the coop door, watching them with that same cautious awe he always carried when they were near. Then he said, "They need more than this." Ruth didn't turn. "What do you mean?" "They need schooling, other children, a church that ain't just 4 hymnals and a roof full of holes. They need a mother and a father." He turned then slowly. "And what are we?" She looked over her shoulder. "I meant officially." That hung in the air for a long while. Amos didn't speak again until sundown. They were on the porch, Ruth in her rocker, Amos beside her, a blanket over both their laps. The girls had gone to bed early, worn out from chasing chickens and drawing shapes in the dust. Amos cleared his throat. "You were married once." Ruth nodded. "So was I." Another nod. Neither of them could stay. "No," she said softly. He turned toward her then, eyes searching her face like it held a truth he hadn't dared ask for until now. "But we stayed." "We did." He shifted closer. I know I'm not an easy man. I don't want easy. He took her hand, held it firm. Do you reckon we ought to try again, together, I mean? She didn't smile, not right away. Instead, she reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small, weathered ribbon. She handed it to him without a word. He recognized it immediately. It had been tied around the wrist of one of the newborns that first day, months ago. The one whose name he still didn't know. I kept it, she said, because I thought maybe it meant something. What's it mean? That even when something starts with grief, it can end with grace. He looked at her a long time. Then, without asking, he kissed her. Not like the first time, not like the rushed, panicked meeting of two survivors in the dark, but gently, with weight, with promise. The next week, the preacher from Dunn's Hollow came. They sent May with a note tied to her doll's arm, because May insisted that dolls were always trusted messengers. The preacher came on horseback, hat in hand, and the vows were spoken beneath the budding branches of the old apple tree. May stood beside Amos. Nora held Ruth's hand. When the preacher said, "Who gives this woman?" May answered without hesitation, "We do." The town never understood it fully. Some whispered Ruth had taken in a stranger too quickly. Others claimed Amos must have been running from something. But no one could argue what they saw, that two girls who had once slept in a barn now walked with heads high beside a man who'd die for them, and a woman who had found her heart again after years of silence. They didn't leave the farm. They built onto it. A schoolroom in the side house, a bigger table in the kitchen, chickens enough to feed 4 every day and still give to the neighbors. The winters came and went. Scars faded. Love did not. Years later, long after the barn had been replaced with a proper stable, and the old ribbon hung framed above the fireplace, Nora asked Ruth, "Why did you take us in?" Ruth had smiled, kneeling to brush the girl's hair from her eyes. "Because when I looked into your face," she whispered, "I saw the answer to every prayer I'd ever spoken." Amos stood behind her then, lifting Nora into his arms, and May leaned against his side, tall now, her shoulders straight. And for the first time in all their lives, no one wondered what they were to each other. They knew. They were family. Not by blood, but by grace, and by the kind of love that chose to stay. The frost had finally abandoned the valley, not with a blaze of color or spring's usual fanfare, but in silence, melting gently into earth that had waited too long to breathe again. The creek behind the barn sang louder now, its waters swollen with melt, whispering promises to the grass that hadn't yet dared turn green. There were no blossoms yet, no birds nesting in the rafters, but something new filled the farm. It was laughter. Not the shy, fractured kind that came in bursts, like the first days when Nora and May had arrived, still brittle, still laced with fear, but the full-hearted sort, the kind children give when the world finally feels safe. May was running across the pasture with her arms wide like wings, pretending to chase a hawk that circled far overhead. Nora was trying to keep up, though her steps were smaller and her legs shorter, giggling breathlessly with each turn in the grass. From the porch, Ruth watched them with a hand pressed lightly to her chest, not for any pain but as though steadying her heart like it beat too loud from joy alone. She rocked slowly in Amos's chair, not hers, not by name, but he'd never once taken it back since she claimed it that first morning the girls arrived. Inside, Amos stood at the kitchen table, smoothing the edges of a letter with calloused fingers. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, eyes narrowed with a mix of concentration and disbelief. Ruth turned when she heard the screen door creak. "Something wrong." He held up the paper. "Judge from county seat. Said he got wind of 2 girls living here, wants to make sure everything's legal." Ruth stilled, the rock of the chair halting as her fingers curled around the arms. "Legal?" she echoed, voice thin. Wants to send a man next week. Says it's routine, just to check on things. The girl stood close to Ruth. Mr. Alden introduced himself briskly. Here on behalf of the county, we've had reports of unregistered minors living under care. Need to ensure proper guardianship is in place. Reports? Amos asked, jaw tight. Word travels, Alden said, without meeting his eyes. Some folks don't like what they can't explain. He stepped into the house with barely a nod. He inspected the kitchen, the pantry, the bedrooms. He made Ruth pull back the quilt on the girl's bed. He poked through drawers, asked what school the girls attended, where they'd been born, what names were on their birth papers. Ruth's hands stayed folded in front of her, but her knuckles were white. At last, Alden returned to the table and opened his ledger. Without proper documentation, he said flatly, this situation may be subject to state removal. The silence was instant, deep, dangerous. Amos leaned forward slowly. You think talking these girls from this house will make em safer? Alden didn't blink. It's not about safety, it's about procedure. They were sleeping in a barn, Amos growled. They were half-starved, they didn't even know their last name. Yes, well, that's precisely the problem. No, Ruth said, suddenly standing. Alden turned. Ruth's hands were trembling, but her voice was. You're wrong. The problem wasn't that they didn't have names. The problem was that nobody gave them one. Alden frowned. We did, she said, stepping between him and the girls. We gave them a roof and warm food, and someone to tuck them in every night. We gave them more than names. We gave them a home. Alden closed his ledger. You'll need to appear before the judge. Then we will, Amos said, and he can look us in the eye. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of quiet waiting and held breath. The neighbors whispered. A few came by with casseroles, others crossed the street. A lawyer from the church offered to help, and Ruth sat through 3 visits answering questions she didn't know had answers. When the day came, they all rode together in the wagon, Amos, Ruth, May, and Nora. The girls wore dresses Ruth had sewn from flour sacks, stiff with starch, and Amos wore his old army coat. He held Ruth's hand the whole ride there, and didn't let go even when they walked into the courthouse. The judge was an older woman with silver hair and a voice like weathered oak. She listened to Amos speak, then to Ruth, then to the girls. May stood straight and said, I don't remember where I come from, but I remember where I'm going, and it's not away from them. Nora didn't say much. She just crawled into Ruth's lap, curled there like a kitten, and fell asleep with her hand clutching Ruth's shawl. The court fell silent. When the gavel fell, it echoed like thunder. Guardianship approved, permanently. They rode home slow. May sang the whole way. And when they returned to the farm, the creek laughed louder, the wind felt softer, and the soil itself seemed to exhale. Years later, long after the fence was painted white and the roof no longer leaked, May would write in her schoolbook. My mama was never my mother by blood, but she was the first person who heard my name and remembered it, and that's all the difference in the world. Ruth found that paper tucked under her pillow one night. She wept like a woman finally filled. And Amos, when he held her hand and asked, You still praying for a child? She only smiled. No, she whispered, not anymore. They'd been answered. Twice. And for the rest of their days, the laughter never stopped echoing in the walls of the old house, like a prayer that didn't end.